I never thought I'd be standing in my own hallway at 3 in the morning, listening to my children discuss the cost of my casket versus cremation, but there I was, clutching my chest as my heart hammered against my ribs. What they didn't know was that while they were planning my funeral, I had already started planning theirs. Financially speaking, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Loretta Hughes, and at 74 years old, I thought I had seen every shade of human greed and selfishness that existed. I was wrong. After 43 years of marriage to my late husband Richard, who passed away 2 years ago from complications related to diabetes, I believed my 3 children would be my comfort in the twilight of my life. Richard and I had worked ourselves to the bone building Hughes Construction from nothing more than a pickup truck and a toolbox into one of the most successful contracting companies in northern Wisconsin. We owned 4 rental properties, had a lakefront home worth well over $2 million, and enough savings to ensure I could live comfortably for the rest of my days without ever worrying about money. Richard always said our children were our greatest investment, and we treated them as such. We paid for Preston's engineering degree at Northwestern, covered every penny of Margot's law school at University of Wisconsin, and when our youngest, Tobias, decided he wanted to pursue his passion for photography, we bought him the most expensive equipment money could buy, and even funded his studio in downtown Madison for the first 3 years until he could get on his feet. We never asked for repayment, never made them feel indebted to us, and certainly never expected them to circle around me like vultures the moment their father was in the ground. But that's exactly what happened, and it took me 18 months to fully understand the depth of their calculated cruelty. The first sign should have been how quickly they all showed up after Richard's funeral. Preston drove up from Chicago with his wife Carmen and their twin boys, claiming he wanted to help me sort through Richard's things and make sure I wasn't overwhelmed by the business decisions that needed to be made. Margot took a leave of absence from her law firm in Milwaukee, insisting that someone needed to review all the legal documents and ensure everything was in proper order for my protection. Even Tobias, who had barely called me once a month while his father was alive, suddenly became the most attentive son, dropping by every few days with groceries and offering to help with yard work. At first, their sudden attention felt like a blessing. After 43 years of marriage, the silence in the house was suffocating. Richard had been my constant companion, my business partner, my best friend, and the man who could make me laugh even on the darkest day. Without him, the house felt like a museum of memories, each room echoing with conversations we'd never have again. So when my children surrounded me with their concern and care, I welcomed it with open arms. Preston was the most persistent about the business aspect. He would sit at my kitchen table with his laptop and spreadsheets, explaining various investment strategies and suggesting that maybe it was time to consider selling Hughes Construction, since I couldn't possibly manage it on my own. He spoke with such authority and confidence that I almost forgot he had never shown the slightest interest in the family business while his father was alive. Richard used to joke that Preston was allergic to manual labor and couldn't tell a Phillips head screwdriver from a hammer if his life depended on it. Margot focused on the legal side, constantly bringing up the importance of updating my will and establishing trusts to protect the family assets from potential tax implications. She would arrive with briefcases full of documents, speaking in legal jargon that made my head spin and using phrases like estate planning optimization and generational wealth preservation. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same themes: how much money was at stake, how complicated these matters could become, and how grateful I should be that I had such devoted children to guide me through it all. Tobias took a different approach. He appealed to my emotions, reminiscing about childhood memories and telling me how worried he was about my health and safety living alone in such a big house. He would bring his camera and suggest taking family photos for posterity, always managing to work into the conversation how expensive it would be to maintain the property and how lonely I must be rattling around in all those rooms by myself. For months I attributed their sudden involvement to grief and genuine concern. They had lost their father after all, and perhaps seeing me struggle with widowhood had awakened a protective instinct they had never needed to express before. I convinced myself that their questions about money and property were practical matters that responsible adult children should address. I told myself that their frequent visits and phone calls were signs of love and maturity. But there were moments when something felt off, when their words carried an undercurrent I couldn't quite identify. Preston would ask detailed questions about the company's client contracts and profit margins, claiming he was just trying to understand the scope of what I was dealing with. Margot would push particularly hard for signatures on documents she claimed were routine updates, always emphasizing how these changes would benefit everyone involved. Tobias would make casual comments about how difficult it must be for me to manage finances and household decisions without Richard's guidance. The conversations always left me feeling somehow diminished, as if my 74 years of life experience and 43 years of partnership in building a successful business had suddenly evaporated the moment Richard died. They spoke to me the way adults speak to children, with a patronizing gentleness that masked an underlying assumption that I was no longer capable of making important decisions on my own. I began to notice patterns in their visit. They rarely came alone, as if they needed witnesses to our conversations, or wanted to present a united front. They would exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking, the kind of silent communication that suggested they had discussed these matters among themselves before bringing them to me. When I would ask questions about their suggestions, or express hesitation about making major changes so soon after Richard's death, they would respond with patient explanations about how these decisions couldn't wait, how opportunities might be lost, how important it was to act quickly in my best interests. The turning point came about 6 months after Richard's funeral, during what Margot called a family financial planning meeting. All three of them had coordinated their schedules to be present, and they had prepared what could only be described as a presentation. Preston had created detailed charts showing the costs of maintaining our properties. Margot had drafted several legal documents that she claimed would streamline my estate, and Tobias had researched assisted living facilities in the area, complete with glossy brochures and pricing information. They laid it all out on my dining room table like a carefully orchestrated campaign. The message was clear. I was too old, too frail, and too overwhelmed to continue living independently or managing the wealth that Richard and I had spent our entire marriage building together. They painted a picture of a future where I would be comfortable and cared for in a nice facility while they handled the burden of managing properties, investments and business decisions that were simply too complex for someone in my condition. The word condition struck me like a physical blow. I wasn't sick. I wasn't mentally impaired. I wasn't struggling financially or emotionally beyond the normal grief of losing a spouse. I was simply older, and apparently in their minds that was enough to render me incompetent. That night, after they had finally left with promises to give me time to think about their suggestions, I sat in Richard's chair and tried to make sense of what had just happened. These were my children, the babies I had nursed through fevers and nightmares, the toddlers I had taught to walk and talk, the teenagers I had supported through heartbreak and disappointment, the young adults I had launched into the world with love and pride. How had they transformed into these calculating strangers who saw me as an obstacle to be managed rather than a mother to be cherished? I began paying closer attention to their conversations, their questions, their suggestions. I started taking notes, writing down exactly what they said and when they said it. I began to see the careful orchestration behind their concern, the way they tag-teamed their approaches, the consistency of their message across multiple conversations. This wasn't spontaneous worry about my well-being. This was a coordinated effort to convince me that I needed their management of my life and my assets. The realization hit me like a cold wave. My children weren't taking care of me out of love. They were positioning themselves to take control of everything Richard and I had worked so hard to build. They saw my widowhood not as a tragedy to be comforted, but as an opportunity to be seized. They looked at me and saw dollar signs, property deeds, and inheritance potential. They had calculated the value of my death and found it more appealing than the cost of my continued independence. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have anticipated in their careful plotting, was that Richard had taught me more than they realized about business, about money, and about reading people's true motivation. He had always insisted that I be involved in every major decision, every contract negotiation, every investment strategy. He had made sure I understood not just the numbers but the psychology behind financial dealing. He had taught me to recognize when someone was trying to manipulate me, even if that someone was family. So while my children continued their campaign to convince me of my own incompetence, I began my own quiet investigation into their lives, their finances and their motivation. What I discovered would change everything, not just for me, but for all of them, because if they wanted to play games with money and manipulation, they had chosen the wrong woman to underestimate. I was about to teach them that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and Richard Hughes hadn't raised a fool. The morning after that family meeting, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt since Richard's death. The fog of grief that had clouded my judgment for months seemed to lift, replaced by a sharp focus that reminded me of the woman I used to be when Richard and I were building our business from scratch. I made myself a strong cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table where my children had spread their charts and brochures the night before, and began to think like the businesswoman I had always been. Richard used to say that the most dangerous opponents were the ones who underestimated you, and my children had just made that fatal mistake. They saw a grieving widow who needed protection and guidance. They had forgotten that before I was their mother I was Loretta Kowalski, the daughter of a Polish immigrant, who had taught me that survival required intelligence, strategy and the ability to spot a con from a mile away. They had forgotten that I was the woman who had worked alongside their father for over 4 decades.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Not as a silent partner but as an equal contributor to every decision that had built our empire. My first step was to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I spent the next week gathering financial documents, not the ones Margot had been so eager to have me sign, but the real ones: bank statements, property assessments, business valuations, investment portfolios, insurance policy. I spread them across Richard's old desk in his study and began calculating the true scope of our wealth. What I found was both reassuring and alarming. Richard and I were worth significantly more than I had realized. Between the business, the properties, the investments, and the life insurance policies, my net worth exceeded $8 million. No wonder my children had suddenly become so attentive. But more troubling was what I discovered when I started examining the suggestions they had been making. If I had followed their advice, if I had signed the documents Margot had prepared and accepted Preston's investment strategies, and moved into the assisted living facility Tobias had researched, I would have effectively transferred control of nearly everything to them, while receiving only a modest monthly allowance for my personal expenses. They had crafted a perfect legal trap disguised as loving concern. Once I signed those papers and moved out of my home, I would have become financially dependent on their goodwill and management decisions. They could have sold properties, liquidated investments, and made business decisions without my input or approval. And if I had objected or tried to regain control, they could have pointed to my advanced age and the legal documents I had willingly signed as evidence that I was no longer competent to manage my own affairs. It was brilliant in its cruelty, and it told me everything I needed to know about who my children had become. But knowledge was only the first weapon in my arsenal. I needed to understand their individual motivations and vulnerabilities if I was going to protect myself and teach them the lesson they so desperately needed to learn. So I began what Richard would have called reconnaissance, carefully gathering information about their current situations, while maintaining the facade of the confused, overwhelmed widow they expected me to be. Preston was the easiest to read because his motivations were the most transparent. His engineering career in Chicago was successful but not spectacular, and his lifestyle had expanded to match his income and then some. Carmen had expensive tastes. Their twin boys were enrolled in elite private schools that cost more than most people's annual salaries, and they lived in a house in an exclusive suburb that stretched their finances to the breaking point. Preston saw his potential inheritance, not as a future security, but as an immediate solution to the financial pressure he had created for himself. During one of his visits, he casually mentioned that he and Carmen were considering expanding their house to add a home office and a larger master suite. He showed me pictures on his phone of the renovations they wanted to make, estimates from contractors, plans for landscaping improvements. The total cost was close to $400,000, money they clearly didn't have. He was already spending his inheritance in his mind, calculating how much he could borrow against his future windfall. Margot's situation was more complex but equally revealing. Her law firm was prestigious and her salary was substantial, but she had been making some poor personal financial decisions that had put her in a precarious position. She had invested heavily in a startup company that was failing, she had co-signed loans for her ex-husband that he was defaulting on, and she had purchased a downtown Milwaukee condo at the peak of the market that was now worth significantly less than what she owed on it. More concerning was what I learned about her professional life. Through some discreet inquiries with Richard's business attorney, who had known Margot since she was a child, I discovered that she was facing potential disciplinary action from the State Bar Association for some questionable financial dealings with client trust funds. Nothing criminal, but serious enough to damage her reputation and potentially affect her earning capacity. She needed money, and she needed it quickly, to clean up the mess she had made of her personal and professional life. Tobias's motivations were perhaps the most disappointing because they revealed how little he had learned about work, responsibility, and self-reliance, despite all the opportunities Richard and I had given him. His photography studio was barely breaking even, not because he lacked talent, but because he lacked the business sense and work ethic necessary to succeed. He had developed expensive habits and an inflated sense of his own artistic importance that made him unwilling to take on the commercial work that would have made his business profitable. He was behind on his rent, behind on his equipment payments, and had been borrowing money from friends and credit cards to maintain the lifestyle he felt entitled to as a successful artist. He saw my inheritance as validation of his artistic pursuits and freedom from the mundane concerns of financial responsibility. In his mind, once he had access to family money, he could focus on his art without worrying about trivial matters like paying bills or earning a living. Each of my children had constructed elaborate justifications for why they deserved immediate access to wealth they had not earned, and each had convinced themselves that managing my money was really about protecting my interests, rather than serving their own. They had become expert at self-deception, which made them dangerous but also predictable. As I gathered this information, I began to formulate a plan that would accomplish several goals simultaneously. I needed to protect my assets from their manipulation, but I also needed to teach them about consequences, responsibility, and the difference between earning something and simply expecting it. Most importantly, I needed to reclaim my position as the matriarch of this family, and remind them that respect is not something that diminishes with age. The plan that began to take shape was inspired by something Richard used to say about business negotiations. The person with the most information, and the least emotional investment, always has the advantage. My children thought they were playing a game where they held all the cards because they assumed I was too grief-stricken and overwhelmed to see what they were doing. They were about to learn that not only could I see their game clearly, but I had been playing it at a much higher level for far longer than they realized. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. Instead of confronting them directly or trying to convince them to change their behavior, I would give them exactly what they thought they wanted while ensuring they learned the true cost of their greed. They wanted control of my money. They could have it, but they would discover that control comes with responsibilities they had never imagined. They wanted me to step aside and let them manage my affair. I would do exactly that, but on terms that would reveal their true capabilities and motivations to everyone, including themselves. But first, I needed to do something that would both protect my interests and test their reaction. I needed to see how far they were willing to go when they thought they were close to getting what they wanted. I needed to create a situation that would force them to show their true colors in a way that could not be explained away or rationalized. That's when I decided to get sick. Not really sick, of course, but sick enough to accelerate their timeline and force them to reveal the depth of their planning and the coldness of their calculations. If they were truly concerned about my well-being, a health scare would bring out their protective instinct. If they were primarily concerned about their inheritance, it would bring out something else entirely. So I began laying the groundwork for my performance, and what I discovered about my children's capacity for cruelty exceeded even my darkest expectations. The opportunity to test my children's true intentions presented itself 3 weeks later when I developed what appeared to be a severe case of bronchitis. What started as a legitimate cold that had lingered longer than usual became the perfect cover for my experiment in family loyalty. I let the cough worsen. I allowed myself to appear more tired and fragile than I actually felt, and I began making subtle comments about feeling dizzy and having trouble catching my breath. The response was immediate and telling. Within hours of my first phone call to Preston mentioning that I wasn't feeling well, all three of my children had somehow coordinated their schedules to check on me, but instead of the warm concern I might have expected, their attention felt clinical, almost predatory. They asked detailed questions about my symptoms, insisted on accompanying me to doctor appointments, and began speaking in hushed tones about the importance of getting a complete medical evaluation. Dr. Martinez, who had been treating Richard and me for over 15 years, confirmed that I had bronchitis and prescribed antibiotics and rest. Nothing serious, nothing life-threatening, certainly nothing that a healthy 74-year-old woman couldn't recover from with proper care. But my children treated his diagnosis like a death sentence disguised as good news. Margot immediately began researching healthcare directives and medical power of attorney documents. She explained that given my age and this recent health scare, it was crucial to have legal protections in place in case I became unable to make medical decisions for myself. She spoke about the importance of appointing someone trustworthy to handle medical and financial decisions if I became incapacitated, and she had already taken the liberty of consulting with colleagues who specialized in elder law. Preston's response was to question whether I should continue living alone. He brought up statistics about elderly people who suffered falls or medical emergencies when no one was around to help them. He painted vivid pictures of scenarios where my condition could worsen suddenly, leaving me helpless and possibly dying alone in my big house. He had updated his research on assisted living facilities and found several that specialized in caring for seniors with respiratory issues. Tobias took the most emotionally manipulative approach. He began visiting daily, bringing flowers and homemade soup, taking pictures of me looking tired and frail. He spoke constantly about how precious our time together was and how important it was to make sure I was comfortable and surrounded by people who loved me. He had even started discussing funeral preferences, claiming he wanted to understand my wishes so the family would be prepared if anything happened. Funeral preferences. My son was asking about funeral preferences because I had bronchitis. That's when I realized they weren't just hoping for my death, they were actively planning for it. This wasn't about protecting an aging mother or ensuring my comfort in my final year. This was about positioning themselves for the inevitable transfer of wealth that would occur when I died, and they wanted to make sure that transfer happened as quickly and smoothly as possible. But I needed proof, something more concrete than suspicious behavior and leading questions. I needed to hear them say what they were really thinking when they believed I couldn't hear them. The opportunity came during one of their coordinated visits, when I excused myself to lie down, claiming the cough was exhausting me. Instead of going to my bedroom, I positioned myself at the top of the stairs where I could hear their conversation in the living room below. What I heard confirmed my worst fears about who my children had become. Preston was the first to speak, his voice carrying the tone of someone discussing a business transaction rather than their mother's health. He said that while my current condition wasn't serious, it was clearly a wake-up call about my declining health and the need to expedite the plans they had been discussing. He suggested that this might be the perfect time to convince me to sign the legal documents Margot had prepared. While I was feeling vulnerable and grateful for their care, Margot agreed, adding that elderly people often made their most important decisions during health scares when they were forced to confront their mortality. She said she had already modified the documents to include healthcare directives that would give them more immediate authority over my medical decisions. Once those were in place, she explained, it would be much easier to minister that I needed more comprehensive assistance with all my affairs. But it was Tobias who said the words that shattered my heart completely. He suggested that they should start making preliminary funeral arrangements, not because he expected me to die immediately, but because planning ahead would show how thoughtful and responsible they were being. He had already spoken with funeral directors about costs and options, and he thought they should probably choose cremation because it was more economical and would allow them to focus the family resources on more important matters. My funeral expenses were being weighed against more important matters by the son I had given everything to. They spent the next hour discussing the practical aspects of my death with the same casual attention they might give to planning a vacation. They talked about the tax implications of inheriting the house versus selling it immediately. They debated the pros and cons of liquidating the business quickly versus maintaining it as a source of ongoing income. They calculated the costs of probate and discussed strategies for minimizing the time and expense involved in settling my estate. Preston mentioned that he had already spoken with his financial advisor about the best ways to invest his portion of the inheritance. Margot talked about using her share to pay off her debts and make some new investments that would set her up for early retirement. Tobias expressed excitement about finally being able to pursue his art without worrying about commercial viability. They were dividing up my life like vultures picking at a carcass, and I was still breathing in the room above them. But the conversation that truly broke my heart came when they started discussing me personally. Margot said she thought I had been depressed since Richard's death, and probably wasn't thinking clearly about important decisions. Preston agreed, adding that grief at my age often led to poor judgment, and that they were really doing me a favor by taking some of the burden off my shoulder. Tobias said he thought I seemed confused and forgetful lately, and maybe I was developing early signs of dementia. They were planning to use a fictional diagnosis of dementia to justify taking control of my life and my money. As I listened to them construct a narrative of my incompetence and plan for my convenient death, I felt something inside me crystallize into a cold, hard determination that would have made Richard proud. These were not my children anymore. These were strangers who happened to share my DNA, and they had declared war on everything I represented and everything I had worked to build. They wanted to treat me like I was already dead. They wanted to make plans for my funeral and my money, as if I was just an obstacle to be managed. They wanted to paint me as confused and incompetent, so they could justify their theft. I would give them everything they thought they wanted, but it would come at a price they never imagined. Because while they were planning my funeral, I was about to plan theirs. Financially speaking, and unlike their crude plotting, my plan would be masterful, legal, and absolutely devastating. They had just made the biggest mistake of their lives, and they didn't even know it yet. I stayed at the top of those stairs for another 30 minutes, listening to my children continue their casual discussion of my demise and their future wealth. Every word was like a knife in my chest, but I forced myself to remain silent and still, gathering intelligence that would become crucial ammunition in the war they had just declared without realizing it. Preston pulled out his phone and started making notes about which assets they thought would be easiest to liquidate quickly. He mentioned that the lakefront property alone was worth nearly $3 million and could probably be sold within 6 months if they priced it aggressively. He had already researched comparable sales in the area and identified 3 real estate agents who specialized in luxury property. The casual efficiency with which he discussed selling my home, the place where I had planned to live out my days, surrounded by memories of Richard, revealed just how little my happiness meant to him compared to his financial gain. Margot contributed her legal expertise to their planning, explaining how they could structure the estate settlement to minimize tax obligations and maximize their individual inheritance. She had already researched the most advantageous ways to divide different types of assets and had identified strategies for avoiding probate on certain property. She spoke with the technical precision of someone who had been researching these matters for months, not someone who had just started thinking about them in response to my recent illness. The depth of their preparation was staggering. This wasn't opportunistic greed that had developed in response to my bronchitis. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been months or possibly years in the making. They had been studying my assets, researching legal strategies, and calculating their inheritance while I was still grieving my husband and trusting them to help me navigate my widowhood with love and support. Tobias mentioned that he had already taken photographs of valuable items in the house that he thought might be worth appraising. He had been documenting my possessions during his frequent visits, creating an inventory of artwork, jewelry, and collectibles that could be sold separately from the real estate. He spoke about my grandmother's china set and Richard's vintage watch collection like they were commodities in a catalog rather than family treasures with deep emotional significance. But the conversation that truly revealed their callousness came when they started discussing my daily routine and living habits. Preston said he thought I was eating poorly and probably not taking proper care of myself, which could accelerate my health decline. Margot suggested that the stress of managing finances and making decisions was clearly taking a toll on my mental and physical well-being. Tobias added that I seemed increasingly isolated and withdrawn, which was common in elderly people and often led to more serious health problems. They were constructing a narrative of my deterioration that would justify their intervention and make their eventual control of my affairs seem necessary and compassionate. But more disturbing was the underlying implication that my declining health would be a natural and perhaps welcome development that would solve their financial problems more quickly. I realized that they weren't just planning for my death, they were hoping for it. Every symptom I displayed, every sign of fatigue or confusion, every indication that I might be struggling with the challenges of aging was being catalogued and interpreted as evidence that their wait for inheritance might be shorter than originally anticipated. The cold calculation behind their concern became even clearer when Preston mentioned that they should probably encourage me to update my life insurance policies to make sure the beneficiaries were properly designated and the death benefits would be processed efficiently. He had researched the typical timeline for life insurance payouts and wanted to make sure there wouldn't be unnecessary delays in accessing those funds. Death benefits, life insurance payouts, efficient processing of my demise. They spent another few minutes discussing practical considerations like funeral costs, estate attorney fees, and the timeline for settling my affair. Tobias had researched average probate periods and suggested that if they were well organized and had all the proper documentation in place, they could probably wrap up everything within 6 to 8 months of my death. 6 to 8 months. They had calculated how long it would take to erase me from legal existence and divide up everything I represented. As their conversation finally began to wind down, I heard Margot say something that crystallized my understanding of who they had become. She suggested that they should probably start being more careful about how they discussed these matters, since I might overhear them and misunderstand their intention. She said it was important to maintain the appearance of being concerned about my well-being while privately taking the steps necessary to protect the family's financial interests. The appearance of concern. Private steps to protect financial interest. Avoiding misunderstandings about their true intentions. My daughter, the lawyer I had put through law school, was instructing her brothers on how to deceive me more effectively while they systematically prepared to take control of my life and assets. She was teaching them to perfect their masks of love and concern while they sharpened their knives for my back. I waited until I heard them moving toward the front door before I made my way quietly back to my bedroom. I listened to them say their goodbyes, heard their promises to check on me the next day, felt their kisses on my forehead as they wished me a speedy recovery. Each gesture of affection felt like a betrayal now that I knew what lay beneath it. After they left, I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to process the enormity of what I had just learned. These people who had emerged from my body, who had been nurtured by my love and shaped by my sacrifices, had become something I didn't recognize. They had transformed into predators who saw me as prey, calculating the value of my death and planning the division of my life like corporate raiders dividing up a conquered company. But as the shock began to fade, it was replaced by something much more powerful, a rage so pure and focused that it reminded me of the woman I had been when Richard and I were fighting to build our business against competitors who thought they could destroy us through intimidation and underhanded tactics. I had been underestimated before, and I had turned that underestimation into a weapon that devastated those who had dared to challenge me. My children thought they were dealing with a weak, confused, grieving widow who could be manipulated and controlled. They were about to discover that they had awakened something far more dangerous, a brilliant businesswoman with 43 years of experience in strategic thinking, unlimited financial resources, and absolutely nothing left to lose. They wanted to plan my funeral. Perfect. While they were busy with that, I would plan something much more comprehensive, the complete destruction of their comfortable assumptions about family, money, and the consequences of greed. They thought they were playing chess while I was playing checkers. They were about to learn that I had been playing three-dimensional chess while they were still trying to figure out which end of the board was theirs. The war they had started with their casual cruelty was about to become a masterclass in strategic thinking, and I was going to enjoy every minute of watching them realize they had chosen the wrong opponent. My education in the true nature of my children's characters was far from complete, but I had learned enough to begin the next phase of my plan. The bronchitis had served its purpose perfectly, revealing not only their hopes for my swift demise, but also the sophisticated level of planning they had already invested in preparing for that eventuality. Now I needed to accelerate their timeline and create opportunities for them to reveal even more of their true selves. The next morning I called Dr. Martinez and scheduled a follow-up appointment. When I arrived at his office, I explained that while the bronchitis was improving, I had been experiencing some concerning symptoms that I thought might be related to stress. I mentioned feeling forgetful, having trouble concentrating, and experiencing moments of confusion that seemed to be getting worse since Richard's death. Martinez, who had known me for years and understood the legitimate effects of grief on cognitive function, recommended some routine tests to rule out any underlying medical issues. He also suggested that I might benefit from counseling to help process my grief and adjust to living alone. His recommendations were sensible and appropriate, but I knew my children would interpret them very differently. I made sure to mention my doctor's visit during the next family phone call, carefully emphasizing the words memory tests and cognitive evaluation, while downplaying the fact that these were routine precautions rather than indicators of serious problem. The response was immediate and predictable. Within 2 hours, all 3 of my children had called back with offers to accompany me to my next appointment. Preston arrived first, carrying a notebook and wearing the serious expression of someone prepared to take charge of a crisis. He had researched my symptoms online and come armed with printouts about early-stage dementia, cognitive decline, and the importance of early intervention. He spoke about the need to be proactive about my mental health and suggested that it might be wise to consider having someone else handle complex financial decisions while I focused on my recovery. Margot showed up with a briefcase full of legal documents that she claimed would protect me in case my condition worsened. She had prepared updated versions of the healthcare directives and financial power of attorney papers, incorporating language that would give them broader authority over my medical and financial decisions. She explained that these were standard precautions that every responsible family should have in place, especially when dealing with aging and potential cognitive decline. Tobias brought his camera again, claiming he wanted to document this important family meeting for future reference. But I noticed that he positioned himself to capture images of me looking tired and confused while my other children explained complex legal and medical concepts. He was creating visual evidence of my incompetence, building a photographic record that could be used to support their narrative of my declining mental state. As they presented their coordinated response to my supposed cognitive issues, I marveled at the speed and efficiency with which they had mobilized their plan. They had been prepared for this moment, waiting for any sign of weakness or vulnerability that would justify their intervention. My mention of memory problems had triggered a response so swift and comprehensive that it could only have been rehearsed. But what truly amazed me was their willingness to exploit what they believed was a serious medical condition for their own financial gain. They weren't offering support and comfort to a mother who might be facing the terrifying prospect of losing her mental faculties. They were seizing an opportunity to accelerate their access to her wealth while disguising their greed as compassionate care. I played my part perfectly, asking confused questions about the legal documents, and expressing anxiety about making important decisions while feeling mentally unclear. I let them convince me that signing some preliminary papers would ease my stress and ensure that people I trusted could help me if my condition deteriorated further. I even managed a few tears as I spoke about feeling scared and overwhelmed by the changes in my thinking. Their relief was palpable as I agreed to sign the initial documents. Preston actually smiled as he watched me put my signature on papers that would give them significant control over my medical care. Margot nearly glowed with satisfaction as she explained how these changes would protect me from making poor decisions while I was dealing with health issues. Tobias captured everything with his camera, documenting what appeared to be a loving family helping an aging mother navigate a difficult medical situation. While they were congratulating themselves on their successful manipulation, I was already 3 steps ahead in a game they didn't even realize they were playing. The documents I had signed were indeed legal, but what they didn't know was that I had spent the previous week consulting with my own attorney, someone they had never met, and whose existence they couldn't have suspected. Jonathan Brennan was Richard's college roommate who had gone on to become one of the most respected estate planning attorneys in the Midwest. He had helped us structure our business and personal finances for decades, but always worked behind the scenes, never attending family gatherings or social events where my children might have encountered him. When I called him the week after overhearing their funeral planning session, He wasn't surprised by what I told him about their behavior. Jonathan had seen this pattern before, he explained. Adult children who had been given too much too easily often developed a sense of entitlement that transformed genuine love into calculated greed when substantial wealth was involved. He had watched families destroy themselves over inheritance disputes, and he had learned to recognize the warning signs early. What made my situation particularly concerning, he said, was the sophisticated level of coordination my children were displaying. Together we had crafted a strategy that would give my children exactly what they thought they wanted while ensuring they learned some crucial lessons about consequences, responsibility, and the true cost of their greed. The documents I signed for them were real and legally binding, but they were only the first layer of a much more complex legal structure that would unfold over time. Jonathan had prepared what he called an educational trust that would become active the moment I was declared mentally incompetent, or upon my death, whichever came first. On the surface, it appeared to be a straightforward inheritance plan that divided my assets among my 3 children according to their expectations. But buried in the legal language were conditions and requirements that would transform their inheritance from a blessing into a comprehensive lesson in accountability. Each of my children would receive their full inheritance, but only after completing specific requirements designed to address their individual character flaws and force them to confront the reality of their situation. Preston would have access to his money only after working full-time for 1 year in a job that paid less than $50,000 annually. Margot would receive her inheritance only after successfully completing 100 hours of community service, helping low-income families with legal issues, completely free of charge. Tobias would get his money only after operating a profitable business for 12 consecutive months without any financial assistance from family or friends. But the real genius of Jonathan's plan lay in the surveillance and accountability measures built into the trust. Each of my children would be required to submit monthly reports documenting their progress toward meeting their requirements. They would be monitored by independent trustees, who would verify their compliance and ensure they were genuinely learning rather than simply going through the motions. And if any of them failed to complete their requirements within 2 years, their inheritance would be donated to charity and redistributed to the siblings who had succeeded. The beauty of this arrangement was that it created exactly the kind of competitive dynamic that would reveal their true characters while forcing them to develop qualities they had never been required to cultivate. They would have to choose between easy money and personal growth, between their sense of entitlement and genuine achievement. Most importantly, they would discover whether their love for each other was stronger than their greed, or whether they would sacrifice family relationships for financial gain. Jonathan also helped me establish what he called a resurrection fund, a separate account that would become accessible to me under specific circumstances. If I ever chose to reveal that my mental decline had been exaggerated or fabricated, this fund would allow me to reclaim control of my assets and revoke the inheritance trust entirely. It was my insurance policy, my guarantee that I could step back into my own life whenever I decided the lesson had been learned. But for now, I was committed to seeing this education through to its conclusion. My children needed to understand what they had become, and they needed to face the consequences of their choices in a way that would either transform them into better people, or reveal them to be beyond redemption. The next phase of my plan required me to become increasingly convincing in my portrayal of cognitive decline. I began making small mistakes in conversations, forgetting names of people I had known for years, asking questions I had already asked multiple times. I started leaving tasks unfinished, misplacing important items, and appearing confused by simple instructions. Each performance was carefully calibrated to suggest progressive deterioration without being so dramatic as to raise suspicions about my authenticity. My children's response to my apparent decline was everything I had expected and worse. Instead of showing genuine concern for my well-being, they seemed energized by each new symptom of confusion I displayed. They began documenting my mistakes, recording conversations where I seemed disoriented, and building a comprehensive case for their eventual need to take complete control of my affair. Preston started visiting with a voice recorder, claiming he wanted to capture family memories but actually collecting evidence of my mental confusion. He would ask me questions about dates, names, and events, then react with exaggerated concern when I gave vague or incorrect answers. He began speaking to me in the slow, patronizing tone people use with children or mental patients, and he started making decisions about my daily routine without asking for my input. Margot accelerated her legal preparations, drafting documents that would transfer increasing levels of authority to the three of them as my condition worsened. She explained these changes as necessary protections for my own safety, but I could see the excitement in her eyes as she described the expanded powers she was granting herself and her brother. She had found a way to combine her legal expertise with her financial desperation, creating a solution that served her professional skills and personal needs. Tobias became my most frequent visitor, arriving daily with his camera and recorder to document what he claimed was my journey through cognitive decline. But his photographs told a different story. He captured images of me looking lost and helpless, struggling with simple tasks, staring blankly at familiar objects. He was creating a visual narrative of my deterioration that could be used to justify any level of intervention they deemed necessary. What disturbed me most was how comfortable they had become with deception. They lied to my face constantly, telling me they were concerned about my health while privately celebrating each sign of my decline. They made decisions about my life without consulting me, then presented those decisions as suggestions they hoped I would consider. They spoke about me in the third person while I was sitting right there, as if my presence was irrelevant to conversations about my own future. But their most revealing behavior emerged when they thought I was sleeping, or otherwise unaware of their presence. I began pretending to nap during their visits, positioning myself where I could overhear their whispered conversations about my condition and their plans for managing my assets. What I heard during these covert discussions removed any remaining doubt about their motivations, and confirmed that my educational plan was not just justified, but necessary. During one particularly illuminating conversation, Preston told his siblings that he had researched the typical progression of dementia and believed my decline was happening faster than normal. He suggested this might be a blessing in disguise, since a prolonged period of incapacity would be emotionally difficult for everyone and financially expensive in terms of care costs. He had calculated the monthly expenses associated with round-the-clock nursing care and determined that my death within the next year or two would actually be the most economically efficient outcome for the family. Economically efficient outcome. He was discussing my death in terms of cost-benefit analysis. Margot agreed with Preston's assessment, adding that she had been researching legal strategies for accelerating the competency hearing process if my condition continued to deteriorate rapidly. She had identified a judge who was known for making quick decisions in cases involving elderly individuals with cognitive decline, and she thought they could probably have me declared legally incompetent within 3 to 6 months, if they presented a strong case supported by medical evidence and family testimony. Tobias contributed his own disturbing perspective, suggesting that they should start making funeral arrangements sooner rather than later, not just for practical reasons, but because planning ahead would help them process their grief and be better prepared to support each other when the time came. He had already spoken with several funeral directors and had collected pricing information for different types of services, from basic cremation to elaborate memorial celebration. The casual cruelty of their planning was breathtaking, but what shocked me even more was their complete lack of guilt or self-doubt about what they were doing. They had convinced themselves that they were being responsible and caring, that their systematic preparation for my demise was evidence of their love and devotion rather than their greed and impatience. They talked about my future as if it were already decided, discussing the timeline for my institutionalization, the schedule for liquidating my assets, and the division of responsibilities for managing my care during whatever time I had left. They had reduced my life to a series of logistical challenges to be solved efficiently and economically. But the conversation that finally pushed me beyond the point of any possible forgiveness came when they started discussing how to handle the family narrative around my decline and death. Margot suggested that they should be careful about how they described my condition to extended family and friends, making sure everyone understood that my deterioration was natural and inevitable rather than the result of any neglect or poor care on their part. Preston agreed, adding that they should probably start preparing other people for my eventual death by mentioning my health problems in casual conversations and expressing their own sadness about watching me fade away. He wanted to establish a consistent story about my brave struggle with dementia and their devoted efforts to care for me during her final months. Tobias said he thought they should document my decline not just for legal purposes, but to create a memorial narrative that would honor my life while demonstrating their commitment to preserving my dignity during a difficult time. He envisioned a photo essay showing my gradual deterioration alongside images of their loving care, a visual story that would serve both sentimental and practical purposes. They were crafting a mythology around my death before I was even dead, creating a narrative that would paint them as devoted children who had sacrificed everything to care for their aging mother. They were planning to use my fabricated dementia and eventual death as evidence of their own virtue, transforming their greed into a story of family love and sacrifice. As I listened to them construct this elaborate fiction, I felt the last vestiges of maternal affection drain away and be replaced by something cold and implacable. These people had forfeited any claim to my love or consideration. They had revealed themselves to be sociopaths, capable of calculating cruelty that went far beyond simple greed. They were planning to steal my life, my dignity, and my legacy, while presenting themselves as heroes in the story of my destruction. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed that cognitive decline meant complete helplessness, that confusion equated to inability, that appearing weak meant being powerless. They had forgotten that the woman they were trying to destroy had spent 4 decades building an empire through strategic thinking, careful planning, and the ability to outmaneuver opponents who underestimated her capability. They thought they were playing a game with a confused old woman who couldn't protect herself. They were actually engaged in psychological warfare with someone who had more experience, better resources, and absolutely nothing left to lose. And while they were busy planning my funeral and dividing my money, I was putting the finishing touches on a plan that would teach them the difference between earning something and simply taking it. The day I had been waiting for finally arrived 6 weeks later, when Martinez called to schedule what he described as a routine follow-up to discuss the results of my cognitive assessment tests. I knew this appointment would be crucial because it would provide the medical documentation my children needed to proceed with their plan to have me declared incompetent. What they didn't know was that I had been carefully coaching my responses during the evaluation to create exactly the results that would trigger the next phase of my educational strategy. I had spent considerable time researching the specific types of cognitive impairment that would justify legal intervention without requiring immediate institutionalization. I needed to appear sufficiently confused to warrant my children's assumption of financial and medical authority, but not so impaired that I would be forced into a care facility where my ability to observe and orchestrate their education would be compromised. During the testing sessions, I had deliberately performed poorly on memory exercises while maintaining my ability to function in daily activities. I gave inconsistent answers to questions about dates and personal history, but demonstrated that I could still handle basic self-care and navigation. I appeared confused about complex financial concepts while showing that I understood simple instructions and social interactions. The goal was to create a profile of someone experiencing moderate cognitive decline who could still live independently with some supervision. Exactly the diagnosis that would give my children maximum control while allowing me to remain in my own home, where I could continue monitoring their behavior and implementing my plan. Dr. Martinez delivered the news with the gentle compassion he reserved for difficult conversations, explaining that the tests showed some concerning changes in my cognitive function that were consistent with early-stage dementia. He emphasized that this didn't mean I was incapable of making decisions or living independently, but it did suggest that I might benefit from additional support with complex tasks and important choices. He recommended that I consider involving family members in financial and medical decisions, not because I was incompetent, but because having trusted advisors could help ensure I didn't become overwhelmed or confused by complicated situations. He also suggested that we should establish legal frameworks for future care decisions, while I was still clearly capable of expressing my preferences and wishes. His recommendations were measured and appropriate, designed to protect my autonomy while acknowledging the reality of cognitive changes that could progress over time. But I knew my children would interpret his words very differently, hearing confirmation of their assumptions about my incompetence and justification for their plans to assume control of my life. I called Preston first with the news, carefully emphasizing the words cognitive decline and family involvement in decisions, while downplaying Dr. Martinez's reassurances about my continued capacity for independent living. His response was immediate and barely concealed excitement, disguised as concern. He said he would call Margot and Tobias right away so they could coordinate their response to this development. Within 3 hours, all 3 of my children were sitting in my living room, with the emergency family meeting they had called to address my diagnosis. They had prepared for this moment with impressive efficiency, arriving with printed research about dementia, legal documents, and what they called a care plan that would ensure my safety and well-being during the progression of my condition. Margot took the lead in explaining the legal implications of my diagnosis, carefully avoiding any language that suggested I was currently incompetent while emphasizing the importance of preparing for future incapacity. She had updated the power of attorney documents to include broader authority over my financial affairs, and she recommended that we should probably transfer some assets into trust accounts that would be easier to manage if my condition worsened. Preston focused on the practical aspects of my care, suggesting modifications to my living situation that would make it safer for someone with cognitive impairment. He had researched home monitoring systems, medication management services, and household safety improvements that he thought would be necessary to ensure I could continue living independently. He also recommended that we should probably start interviewing home care providers who could assist me with daily activities as my condition progressed. Tobias approached the situation from an emotional angle, talking about the importance of preserving family memories and documenting my life story while I was still able to share my recollections clearly. He wanted to create what he called a legacy project that would capture my voice and experiences for future generations. He had already researched videography services that specialized in recording elderly family members sharing their life story. Their presentation was masterful in its combination of apparent concern and subtle manipulation. They painted a picture of a loving family rallying around an aging mother who needed protection and support during a difficult health challenge. They emphasized their commitment to preserving my dignity and autonomy while ensuring I received appropriate care and assistance. But beneath their caring words, I could hear the underlying agenda that drove their suggestion. Every recommendation involved transferring some aspect of control or authority from me to them. Every safety measure created additional oversight of my activities and decisions. Every care service established another layer of monitoring and documentation that could be used to build a case for my increasing incompetence. The legal documents Margot wanted me to sign would give them broad authority over my financial affairs, justified as necessary protection for someone with cognitive impairment, who might make poor decisions or become vulnerable to exploitation. The home monitoring systems Preston recommended would track my daily activities and create detailed records of any confusion or mistakes that could support future competency challenges. The legacy project Tobias proposed would create hours of recorded material documenting my mental state and potentially capturing evidence of cognitive decline. As they outlined their comprehensive plan for managing my condition, I marveled at how quickly they had moved from hoping for my death to actively working to accelerate my legal and practical demise. They were no longer waiting for me to die naturally. They were systematically dismantling my autonomy and independence, creating the conditions that would allow them to assume complete control of my life while maintaining the appearance of devoted care. I agreed to their suggestions with the confused gratitude they expected, signing documents I didn't fully understand and accepting help I claimed to appreciate. I let them install monitoring devices that would track my movements and activity. I allowed them to schedule regular visits from care providers who would report on my condition and capabilities. I even participated enthusiastically in Tobias's legacy project, sharing rambling stories that seemed to demonstrate increasing confusion about dates, names, and sequences of events. But while they were congratulating themselves on their successful management of my decline, they were actually providing me with everything I needed to document their systematic abuse of an elderly family member. The monitoring devices they installed would record their conversations when they thought I couldn't hear them. The care providers they hired would witness their treatment of me and could testify about the difference between my apparent condition and my actual capability. The legacy recordings would capture not just my supposed confusion but also their leading questions and manipulative responses to my answers. They were creating a comprehensive record of their own criminal behavior while believing they were building a case for my incompetence. Every piece of evidence they gathered to support their control over my life would eventually be used to demonstrate their guilt in what amounted to elder abuse, financial exploitation, and conspiracy to commit fraud. But the most damaging evidence would come from their own words and actions during the weeks that followed my diagnosis. As they became more confident in their control and more comfortable with their deception, they began revealing the true depth of their cruelty and the calculated nature of their exploitation. And I was recording every word, documenting every action, and preparing to use their own evidence against them in a way that would destroy not just their inheritance hopes, but their entire understanding of who they were and what they had become. The education was about to begin in earnest, and they were going to learn that the woman they had tried to bury was not only still alive, but more dangerous than they had ever imagined. 3 weeks after my diagnosis became official, my children had settled into a routine of managing my life with an efficiency that would have been impressive if it weren't so devastating. They had divided responsibilities among themselves like corporate executives handling a complex project, each taking ownership of specific aspects of my care and supervision, while coordinating their efforts to maintain comprehensive control. Preston had assumed authority over what he called my residential security and daily welfare. He visited every morning before work to check on my condition and ensure I had taken my medications properly. He had installed a sophisticated home monitoring system that tracked my movements throughout the house and sent alerts to his phone if I left the property or engaged in any activities he deemed potentially dangerous. He also managed my household staff, interviewing and hiring a housekeeper who would report on my behavior and a meal delivery service that would ensure I ate properly without the risks associated with cooking. Margot had taken control of my legal and financial affairs with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly how much power she was accumulating. She reviewed all my bank statements and investment accounts, ostensibly to monitor for signs of financial confusion but actually to gain complete visibility into my assets and spending pattern. She had arranged for all my bills to be paid automatically and had transferred signature authority for most accounts to herself as my designated financial guardian. She also scheduled regular meetings with my attorney and accountant to review my legal status and ensure all documentation was properly maintained. Tobias had positioned himself as my emotional caregiver and family historian, visiting several times each week to check on my mental state and continue his legacy documentation project. He had expanded his video recording efforts to include what he called daily wellness assessments, short interviews where he asked about my feelings, concerns, and recollections as a way of tracking my cognitive decline over time. He also served as the family communications coordinator, updating extended relatives and family friends about my condition and our collective efforts to ensure my comfort during this difficult period. Their coordination was remarkable in its sophistication and horrifying in its implication. They had created a comprehensive system of surveillance, control, and documentation that effectively imprisoned me in my own home while maintaining the appearance of loving care. Every aspect of my life was monitored, every decision was filtered through their approval, and every interaction was recorded for potential use in future legal proceedings. But what truly revealed their characters was how they behaved when they thought they were unobserved and unrecorded. The home monitoring system Preston had installed included audio capabilities that he apparently forgot about once the devices were in place. The care providers Margot had hired were required to submit detailed reports about my condition, but they also witnessed my children's interactions with me and began to notice discrepancies between my apparent capabilities and the level of control being exercised over my life. Most importantly, Tobias's own recording equipment captured conversations and interactions that he never intended to preserve, creating an extensive audio and video record of their true attitudes toward me and their real motivations for the care they provide. During one particularly revealing incident, I pretended to fall asleep in my living room chair while Preston and Margot were reviewing my financial statements at the kitchen table. The monitoring system recorded their entire conversation, during which they discussed their frustration with how slowly my condition was progressing and their impatience with the timeline for gaining complete control of my assets. Preston complained that my cognitive decline seemed to have plateaued at a level that was inconvenient for their purposes. I was still capable enough to raise questions about their decisions and express preferences about my care, but impaired enough to justify their intervention in my affairs. He wished my condition would either improve enough to eliminate their legal authority, or worsen enough to justify more aggressive measures. Margot was more calculating in her analysis, explaining that my current level of impairment was actually ideal for their long-term strategy. I was incompetent enough to justify their control, but not so impaired that I required expensive institutional care that would drain my assets before they could inherit them. She estimated that if my condition remained stable, they could maintain their current level of authority while preserving the maximum amount of wealth for eventual distribution. Their conversation revealed not just their impatience with my failure to deteriorate according to their schedule, but their clinical approach to calculating the optimal level of my suffering for their financial benefit. They discussed my cognitive decline like investors analyzing a portfolio, weighing the costs and benefits of different scenarios and strategizing about how to maximize their return. But their most damaging admissions came when they thought I was completely unconscious and unable to hear or understand their work. During one of Tobias's visits, when I appeared to be napping deeply, he made a phone call to someone he identified as a funeral director, discussing preliminary arrangements for what he called the eventual service that would be needed when my condition reached its natural conclusion. He spoke casually about cremation versus burial costs, the advantages of pre-planning to lock in current prices, and the importance of choosing options that would create an appropriate memorial while remaining financially reasonable. He mentioned that the family was dealing with significant healthcare expenses related to my care, and wanted to ensure the funeral costs didn't place an additional burden on the estate. Healthcare expenses related to my care, the monitoring devices, meal services, and occasional nursing visits they had arranged cost less than $1,000 per month, barely a rounding error in my financial situation. But Tobias was already using these minimal expenses to justify economizing on my funeral arrangement. More disturbing was his discussion of the timing and logistics of my death. He asked about the typical timeline for completing arrangements once they received notification, the procedures for transporting my body from my home or a hospital, and the documentation required to proceed with cremation. He was treating my death like a business transaction that required advanced planning and efficient execution. The funeral director apparently asked about my current condition, because Tobias explained that I was experiencing moderate dementia with a prognosis that was difficult to predict precisely. He said the family wanted to be prepared for any eventuality while hoping for the best possible outcome, but he emphasized that they needed to be realistic about the progression of my disease. During this conversation, I was lying less than 10 feet away from him, alert and aware, listening to my youngest child discuss the practical arrangements for disposing of my body with the same tone he might use to plan a vacation or schedule a home repair. The casual cruelty of his planning was breathtaking, but what hurt most was the complete absence of genuine grief or loss in his voice. He wasn't discussing my death because it was an inevitable tragedy that he wanted to be prepared to handle with dignity and love. He was planning my funeral because it was a necessary expense that needed to be managed efficiently to preserve maximum value for my inheritance. As weeks passed, their true attitudes became increasingly clear through dozens of recorded conversations, documented interactions, and witnessed behaviors that revealed the gap between their public personas, as devoted caregivers, and their private reality, as calculating opportunity. The very system they had created to monitor and control me had become a comprehensive documentation of their own criminal behavior, but the most damaging evidence emerged when they began to disagree among themselves about the timeline and methods for accelerating my decline. What started as minor disagreements about care strategies evolved into arguments about the most effective ways to speed up my deterioration, while maintaining plausible deniability about their intention. Preston favored what he called a natural progression approach, arguing that they should simply wait for my condition to worsen on its own, while ensuring I didn't receive any care or stimulation that might slow the decline. He wanted to eliminate physical therapy, reduce social interactions, and minimize mental stimulation that might help me maintain cognitive function longer than necessary. Margot preferred a more aggressive legal strategy, suggesting that they should petition the court for a formal competency hearing that would give them broader authority over my care decisions. She argued that waiting for my condition to deteriorate naturally was inefficient and risky, since I might remain stable at my current level of impairment for years. She wanted to establish legal precedent for their authority that would allow them to make more dramatic changes to my living situation and care. Tobias suggested what he euphemistically called compassionate intervention, arguing that allowing me to continue struggling with confusion and cognitive decline was cruel and that they should consider options that would end my suffering more quickly. He spoke about the dignity of death with dementia and the importance of preventing prolonged deterioration that would be traumatic for everyone involved. Their arguments about the best methods for hastening my death were recorded by their own surveillance systems, creating an audio record of 3 adult children actively conspiring to accelerate their mother's decline for financial gain. They debated the ethics and logistics of various approaches to ending my life while maintaining the appearance of natural causes and devoted care. As I listened to these conversations from my supposedly unconscious position in various rooms of my house, I realized that my children had progressed far beyond simple greed or even criminal exploitation. They had become something genuinely evil, capable of planning and discussing my murder with the same casual attention they might give to planning a business meeting or social gathering. But they had made the same mistake that had destroyed countless criminals throughout history. They had become overconfident in their apparent success, and careless about concealing their true intentions. They assumed that their victim was helpless and that their crimes were undetectable. They believed they were too clever to be caught and too careful to leave evidence. They were about to discover that their comprehensive monitoring and documentation system had recorded every word they spoke, every plan they made, and every admission of guilt they thought was private and secure. The very tools they had used to control and exploit me had become the instruments of their own destruction. And tomorrow, when they gathered for what they believed would be another routine family meeting to coordinate my care, they would finally learn the true cost of their greed and the real meaning of justice. The lesson was about to begin, and they were going to discover that the woman they had tried to destroy was not only still very much alive, but more dangerous than they had ever imagined possible. The morning of reckoning arrived on a Tuesday that felt charged with electricity despite the overcast sky hanging over Lake Winnebago. I had scheduled what I told my children would be an important family meeting to discuss changes to my will and estate planning, changes that I claimed Martinez had recommended based on my diagnosis. What they didn't know was that this meeting would be their final examination in a course they had unknowingly been taking for months. I spent the early hours of that day making final preparations, reviewing the extensive documentation I had gathered and ensuring that every piece of evidence was properly organized for maximum impact. The dining room table where we would meet had been equipped with recording devices that would capture every word, every expression, every moment of their education and consequence. Hidden cameras provided multiple angles of documentation, and the home monitoring system they had installed would serve as additional backup for everything that was about to unfold. Jonathan Brennan had arrived at sunrise, parking his car 3 blocks away and entering through the back door to avoid being seen by any of my children who might arrive early.
He positioned himself in Richard's study with a clear view of the dining room through the partially open door. Equipped with his own recording equipment, and prepared to intervene if the situation escalated beyond my ability to control it safely. We had rehearsed this moment for weeks, anticipating various responses and preparing for different scenarios based on my children's personalities and likely reactions. Jonathan had experience with similar family confrontations and had warned me that the initial shock of discovery often triggered unpredictable behavior, ranging from denial and anger to attempts at manipulation or even violence. We were prepared for all possibilities. At precisely 10 o'clock, Preston arrived with his usual punctuality. carrying a briefcase and wearing the serious expression he had adopted whenever discussing my health and care. He kissed my forehead with the perfunctory affection that had become his standard greeting and asked how I was feeling with the patronizing concern that made my skin crawl. Margot arrived 15 minutes later, apologizing for her slight delay and explaining that she had been coordinating with the bank about some account transfers she wanted to discuss during our meeting. She was carrying multiple folders of legal documents and had clearly prepared extensively for what she expected to be another session of expanding her control over my affairs. Tobias was the last to arrive, entering with his camera equipment and explaining that he thought today's meeting might be significant enough to document for the family record. He spent several minutes setting up his video equipment, adjusting lighting and camera angles to capture what he expected would be my confused agreement to whatever new restrictions and limitations his siblings had prepared. As they settled around the dining room table, I marveled at their comfortable assumption of authority and their casual confidence in their ability to manipulate me. They arranged their documents and devices like generals preparing for a battle they had already won, discussing my condition and care needs as if I were not present to hear their words. Preston opened the meeting by expressing his appreciation for my willingness to address important planning issues despite my health challenges. He said he understood that these discussions could be confusing and overwhelming for someone in my condition, but he emphasized how important it was to make these decisions while I was still capable of understanding and agreeing to what was best for my own protection. Margot agreed, adding that the legal changes they were recommending had been carefully designed to ensure my comfort and security while protecting the family assets from potential complications that could arise if my condition continued to deteriorate. She explained that elderly individuals with cognitive impairment were often targeted by scammers and predators who tried to take advantage of their confusion, and these new arrangements would provide multiple layers of protection against such exploitation. Tobias contributed his emotional perspective, talking about how difficult it was to watch me struggle with the changes in my thinking and memory. He said the family just wanted to make sure I felt supported and cared for during this challenging time, and that meant taking some of the burden of complex decisions off my shoulders so I could focus on my health and happiness. Their presentation was polished and apparently sincere, delivered with the kind of caring authority that would have been convincing to anyone who didn't know what lay beneath their words. They had perfected their roles as devoted children making difficult but necessary decisions to protect their declining mother. They truly believed they had become masters of manipulation and deception. But as they outlined their latest round of proposed changes to my legal and financial arrangements, I could see the greed and impatience that drove their suggestions. They wanted to accelerate the timeline for transferring assets into accounts they control. They proposed hiring additional care providers who would monitor my condition more closely and provide detailed reports about my capabilities. They recommended updating my medical directives to give them broader authority over treatment decisions if my condition worsened. Each suggestion was presented as being in my best interest, but the cumulative effect would have been to strip away every remaining element of my autonomy and independence. They were systematically dismantling my legal personhood while maintaining the fiction that they were protecting me from my own incompetence. When they finished their presentation, they looked at me expectantly, waiting for the confused gratitude and passive agreement they had come to expect from their supposedly declining mother. Preston pulled out documents that had already been prepared for my signature. Margot opened her laptop to show me account transfer authorizations that just needed my approval. Tobias adjusted his camera to capture my compliance with their latest round of exploitation. Instead, I stood up from the table and walked to the sideboard where I had placed a thick folder containing months of documentation about their behavior. I returned to my seat and placed the folder in the center of the table directly in front of their shocked faces. Then I spoke in a voice that was clear, strong, and completely free of the confusion and hesitation they had grown accustomed to hearing from me. Before we discuss any changes to my legal arrangements, I said, I think we should review some of the interesting information I've gathered about your activities over the past few months. The transformation in their expressions was immediate and profound. Preston's confident smile faltered as he tried to process the sudden change in my demeanor. Margot's professional composure cracked as she stared at the folder with growing alarm. Tobias actually reached toward his camera as if to turn it off, then stopped when he realized how that action would look. I don't understand, Preston said slowly, his voice already showing signs of the panic that was beginning to build behind his eyes. Of course you don't, I replied. Understanding would require you to see me as something other than a confused old woman who could be easily manipulated and controlled. Understanding would require you to remember that before I was your declining mother, I was the woman who helped your father build a multi-million-dollar business by outthinking and outmaneuvering people who underestimated us. I opened the folder and began removing documents, photographs, and transcripts, arranging them on the table in front of my children like evidence at a criminal trial. Bank statements, showing their research into my accounts, legal documents they had prepared without my knowledge, photographs they had taken to document my supposed decline, and most damaging of all, transcripts of their recorded conversations discussing my death, my funeral arrangements, and their plans for dividing my inheritance. This folder contains documentation of conspiracy to commit elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraud, and what can only be described as planning my murder, I continued. Every conversation you thought was private has been recorded. Every document you prepared in secret has been copied. Every plan you made for my death, and your inheritance, has been documented with evidence that would stand up in any courtroom. The silence that followed was deafening. Preston looked like he had been physically struck. Margot's face had gone completely white as she stared at the transcripts of conversations she remembered having. Tobias was frantically trying to understand how his own recording equipment could have been used against them. The home monitoring system you installed to spy on me, I said, enjoying the growing horror in their eyes. It recorded your conversations when you thought I was sleeping. The care providers you hired to document my decline. They witnessed the difference between my actual capabilities and the helpless confusion you wanted them to report. The legal documents you had me sign, they were reviewed and modified by my attorney before I signed them, creating a paper trail of your attempts to defraud me. I stood up again and walked around the table, stopping behind each of their chairs as I continued my explanation. Preston, I said, placing my hand on his shoulder as he flinched away from my touch. You calculated the economic efficiency of my death versus the cost of my continued care. You researched the timeline for probate proceedings so you could access my money as quickly as possible. You installed surveillance equipment in my home and hired people to monitor my every movement. All of this has been documented and recorded. I moved to Margot's chair, where she sat frozen in what appeared to be shock. Margot, you prepared legal documents designed to strip away my autonomy and transfer control of my assets to yourself and your brothers. You researched judicial procedures for having me declared incompetent, based on fabricated evidence of cognitive decline. You discussed strategies for accelerating my legal death, while maintaining plausible deniability about your intentions. Every document you prepared, every strategy you discussed, every lie you told has been preserved as evidence. Finally, I stopped behind Tobias, who was staring at his camera equipment as if it had betrayed him personally. And Tobias, you made preliminary funeral arrangements while I was still alive and listening to your conversation. You discussed the logistics of my death, like you were planning a vacation. You created a visual record of my supposed decline using staged photographs and manipulated interviews. Your own recordings have captured evidence of your participation in conspiracy to exploit and potentially murder your mother. I returned to my seat at the head of the table, facing three people who had believed they were my children, but had revealed themselves to be something much more dangerous and much less redeemable. The question now, I said, is what happens next. You have three options, and I suggest you choose carefully, because this decision will determine not just your financial future but whether you face criminal prosecution for what you've done. Preston found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. This is impossible. You have dementia. Dr. Martinez confirmed your diagnosis. You signed legal documents, acknowledging your cognitive decline. I smiled at him with the kind of cold satisfaction that Richard used to display when a competitor revealed the weakness of their position. Dr. Martinez confirmed that I performed poorly on cognitive assessment tests. He never said I was incapable of strategic thinking or planning. The legal documents I signed were reviewed and modified by my attorney before I ever put pen to paper. And the cognitive decline you observed was a carefully crafted performance designed to reveal your true characters and document your criminal behavior. Margot leaned forward, her legal training finally overcoming her shock. Even if that's true, even if you've been pretending, you still signed documents giving us authority over your care and finances. Those signatures are legally binding regardless of your motivations. Actually, I said, they're not. Jonathan Brennan stepped out of the study where he had been listening and observing, carrying his own briefcase and looking every inch the experienced attorney he was. My children stared at him with growing confusion and alarm as he took a seat at the table and began removing documents from his case. Mrs. Hughes retained my services several months ago, he explained in the calm professional tone that had intimidated opposing counsel for decades. Every document she signed for you was reviewed and modified before signature to include language that invalidated the entire agreement if signed under duress or false pretenses. Since Miss Hughes was fully competent when she signed these documents and was acting under my legal advice to protect herself from exploitation, none of your supposed authority has ever been legally valid. He spread several documents across the table, pointing to specific sections as he continued his explanation. Furthermore, your systematic exploitation of someone you believe to be mentally impaired constitutes elder abuse under state law. Your coordination to defraud her of her assets represents criminal conspiracy, and your discussions about accelerating her death could be prosecuted as conspiracy to commit murder. Tobias finally found his voice, though it cracked with emotion as he spoke. We never intended to hurt her. We were trying to protect her from making mistakes because of her condition. Everything we did was out of love and concern for her well-being. The laughter that escaped from my throat was harsh and bitter. Love, you researched cremation costs while I was sitting 10 feet away from you. Concern, you calculated how much money you could save if I died quickly instead of requiring expensive care. Protection, you systematically documented every sign of weakness or confusion you could exploit to justify taking control of my life. I leaned forward, looking each of them directly in the eyes as I delivered the verdict they had earned through months of calculated cruelty. You are not my children anymore. You are strangers who happen to share my DNA, and you have forfeited any claim to my love, my money, or my consideration. But I am not without mercy, and I am prepared to offer you an education in consequences that might actually teach you something about the difference between earning something and simply taking it. Jonathan handed me another folder, this one containing the documents that would determine their futures based on choices they were about to make. Option 1, I said, opening the folder. You can accept full responsibility for your actions, cooperate with law enforcement in documenting your crimes, and participate in a rehabilitation program I have designed specifically for your individual character flaw. If you choose this option, you will eventually receive a portion of your inheritance, but only after proving you have learned to value something other than money. I pulled out the first set of documents, placing them where all three could see the detailed requirements Jonathan and I had crafted for their education. Option 2, I continued, you can deny responsibility, challenge my competence in court, and fight to maintain your claims on my assets. If you choose this option, I will use every piece of evidence I have gathered to prosecute you for elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. You will lose any possibility of inheritance. You will face significant legal expenses defending yourselves, and you will very likely spend time in prison. The third set of documents were criminal complaints that Jonathan had prepared, ready to be filed with law enforcement if my children chose to continue their war against me. Option 3, I said, you can simply walk away, leave my house, never contact me again, and disappear from my life permanently. If you choose this option, you will receive nothing from my estate, but you will also face no criminal prosecution, as long as you never attempt to contact me or interfere with my life again. I closed the folder and sat back in my chair, studying their faces as they tried to process the magnitude of their situation and the choices they were being forced to make. You have 24 hours to decide, I said. Tomorrow at noon, you will return here and inform me of your decision. Choose wisely, because this is the only opportunity you will ever have to demonstrate that there might still be something redeemable in the people you have become. Preston, Margot, and Tobias sat in stunned silence for several minutes, occasionally looking at each other with expressions that ranged from shock to anger to something that might have been fear. They were clearly struggling to understand how completely their positions had been reversed and how thoroughly their careful planning had been turned against them. Finally, Preston stood up slowly, his legs apparently unsteady as he tried to maintain his composure. "This is insane," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can't just manipulate us and then pretend we're the criminals." "Actually," Jonathan interjected, "that's exactly what she can do, and what she has done. You attempted to manipulate someone you believed was mentally impaired for financial gain. She demonstrated that she was fully competent and gathered evidence of your criminal behavior. The law is quite clear about which of these actions constitutes criminal activity." Margot gathered her documents with shaking hands, her legal training apparently insufficient to help her process the reality of her situation. "We need time to consider our options and consult with our own attorneys," she said. "Of course," I replied. "That's why you have 24 hours. But I should mention that any attorney you consult will likely advise you that the evidence against you is overwhelming, and that your best option is probably to accept responsibility and hope for lenience." Tobias was still staring at his recording equipment as if he couldn't believe it had been used to document his own confession to planning my murder. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked. "Since the night I overheard you discussing my funeral costs and the economic advantages of my quick death," I answered. "You declared war on me that night, though you were too arrogant to realize I was capable of fighting back. Everything that has happened since then has been your education in the consequences of underestimating your opponent." They left my house that day as different people than they had been when they arrived. They had entered as confident predators who believed they were moments away from completing their systematic destruction of their mother's autonomy and independence. They left as exposed criminals who had been outmaneuvered by someone they had dismissed as weak and confused. But their education was far from complete. The choices they made over the next 24 hours would determine not just their financial futures, but their moral ones as well. They would have to decide whether they were capable of growth, change, and redemption, or whether they were simply predators who had been caught and deserved whatever punishment awaited them. As I watched them drive away from my house, possibly for the last time, I felt a mixture of sadness and satisfaction that I knew Richard would have understood. We had always believed that the most important battles were fought not for money or property but for principles and values that defined who we were as people. My children had forgotten those values, but they were about to learn whether they were capable of remembering them when the cost of forgetting became too high to bear. Their final examination would begin tomorrow, and the grades they earned would determine the rest of their lives. The evening after my children left with their 24-hour ultimatum, I sat in Richard's chair and tried to process the emotional complexity of what I had just accomplished. For months I had been living a double life, playing the role of a confused and declining elderly woman while secretly documenting the systematic betrayal of 3 people I had loved more than my own life. The psychological toll of maintaining that deception while watching my children reveal their true characters had been enormous, but it was nothing compared to the grief I felt for the loss of the family I thought I had. The children who had left my house that afternoon were strangers wearing familiar faces. They looked like Preston, Margot, and Tobias, but they had revealed themselves to be calculating predators who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle between them and my money. The transition from loving mother to strategic opponent had been necessary for my survival, but it had required me to bury emotions and instincts that had defined my identity for over 40 years. Jonathan stayed for dinner, partly to ensure I was safe in case my children decided to return and confront me, but mostly because he understood that I needed someone to talk through the emotional aftermath of the day's revelations. He had handled similar family situations before and knew that even justified confrontations with criminal relatives could leave lasting psychological scars on the victims who had been forced to defend themselves. As we ate the meal I had prepared, Jonathan asked me how I was feeling about the choices I had given my children and what I expected them to decide. It was a question I had been asking myself since they left, trying to predict their responses based on the personalities they had revealed over the past few months. Preston would probably choose option 1, I told Jonathan. His engineering background made him naturally inclined toward problem-solving approaches, and his financial pressures were severe enough that he couldn't afford to lose any possibility of inheritance. He would likely view the rehabilitation requirements as obstacles to be overcome rather than genuine opportunities for personal growth, but he would probably comply with the conditions if it meant eventually accessing some portion of my wealth. Margot's choice was harder to predict because her legal training gave her a better understanding of the criminal exposure she faced, but also made her more likely to believe she could fight the charges successfully. Her pride and professional reputation were at stake, and she might decide that challenging my competence in court was worth the risk if it preserved her career and public image. On the other hand, her financial problems were severe enough that she might not be able to afford the legal fees required for a prolonged battle. Tobias was the most likely to simply walk away. I thought his artistic temperament made him conflict-averse, and his financial irresponsibility meant he probably couldn't sustain a legal fight even if he wanted to. He was also the most emotionally immature of my children and might respond to the stress by simply pretending the situation didn't exist, rather than confronting the consequences of his action. But predicting their responses was less important than understanding what each choice would reveal about their capacity for redemption. The rehabilitation program Jonathan and I had designed was genuinely challenging but ultimately fair, requiring each of them to demonstrate personal growth while providing them with opportunities to rebuild relationships with me and each other. The legal battle option would be expensive and humiliating for them, but would also provide me with the satisfaction of seeing justice served through official channels. The walking away option would be the cleanest break for everyone but would leave unresolved questions about whether they were capable of learning from their mistakes. Jonathan asked whether I was prepared for the possibility that they might choose the legal battle option, forcing me to follow through on my threat to prosecute them for their crime. It was a sobering question because criminal prosecution would mean publicly exposing the family dysfunction that I had spent months documenting in private. The evidence against them was overwhelming, but using it would require me to testify about their systematic abuse and exploitation in open court, creating permanent public records of their betrayal and my response. I told him I was prepared for any outcome because the alternative was accepting their continued exploitation and abuse until my actual death. They had forced me into this position by their own choices, and I refused to enable their criminal behavior simply to preserve family harmony that had never actually existed. If they chose to fight me in court, I would use every weapon at my disposal to protect myself and ensure they faced appropriate consequences for their action. But I also admitted that part of me still hoped they would choose the rehabilitation option, not because I believed they deserved forgiveness but because I wanted to believe that the children I had raised were still reachable somewhere beneath the greed and calculation they had displayed. The program Jonathan and I had designed would force them to confront the reality of their actions while giving them opportunities to demonstrate genuine change if they were capable of it. As the evening progressed, Jonathan helped me review the security measures we had implemented to protect me during the next phase of this confrontation. The house was equipped with panic buttons that would summon both police and private security if I felt threatened. My bank accounts and legal documents were protected by additional layers of authentication that would prevent any attempts at financial retaliation. And most importantly, multiple copies of all evidence against my children were stored in secure locations that would ensure the documentation survived any attempts to destroy or suppress it. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of sharp winter light that made everything appear more defined and significant than usual. I spent the early hours preparing for my children's return, reviewing the documents and options I would present to them based on their decision. Jonathan arrived at 11 o'clock, giving us time to make final preparations before the noon deadline. At exactly 12 o'clock, Preston's car pulled into my driveway, followed immediately by Margot's sedan and Tobias's battered pickup truck. They had apparently coordinated their arrival time, which suggested they had spent the previous evening discussing their options and possibly trying to develop a unified response to my ultimatum. They entered my house with expressions that ranged from grim determination to barely concealed anger, taking their seats around the dining room table without the casual confidence they had displayed just 24 hours earlier. The balance of power had shifted so completely that they now felt like visitors in a house where they had previously acted like owners. Preston spoke first, his voice carefully controlled as he announced their collective decision. "We've talked it over," he said, "and we want you to know that we never intended to hurt you. Everything we did was motivated by genuine concern for your well-being, and if our actions were misinterpreted or caused you distress, we sincerely apologize. It was a carefully worded non-apology that admitted no wrongdoing while attempting to reframe their exploitation as misunderstood care. But before I could respond, Margot continued with what was clearly a prepared statement. However, she said, we also believe that your accusations against us are based on misunderstandings and misinterpretations of conversations taken out of context. We don't believe we've committed any crimes, and we think the evidence you've gathered has been selectively edited to support conclusions that aren't justified by our actual intention. Tobias completed their presentation by adding, "We love you, Mom, and we want to work together to resolve this situation without involving law enforcement or creating permanent damage to our family relationship. We're hoping you'll reconsider your ultimatum and give us a chance to explain our perspective on what happened." Their response was exactly what I had expected, an attempt to maintain their positions while avoiding accountability for their actions. They were trying to negotiate from a position of weakness while pretending they still had leverage to influence the outcome of this confrontation. Jonathan and I exchanged a glance that confirmed we were both thinking the same thing. They had chosen the worst possible response by attempting to minimize their crimes while refusing to accept responsibility for their behavior. They were essentially forcing me to choose between prosecuting them and allowing them to escape consequences entirely. "I see," I said, standing up from the table and walking to the sideboard where I had placed 3 sealed envelopes containing their inheritance documents. "So your decision is to deny responsibility, minimize your actions, and attempt to manipulate me into dropping my charges against you. We're asking you to be reasonable," Preston said, his voice showing the first signs of desperation. "We're family. Families work through problems together instead of destroying each other over misunderstandings." "Family?" I repeated, picking up the first envelope and turning to face them. "Is that what you think we are? After months of planning my death and calculating the value of my assets, after systematically documenting my supposed decline so you could steal my autonomy and independence, after discussing the economic advantages of my quick death versus the costs of my continued care." I opened Preston's envelope and removed the documents inside, holding them up so he could see what he was about to lose forever. "This envelope contains your inheritance, Preston. $2.3 million in cash and property that would have been yours if you had chosen to accept responsibility for your actions and participate in the rehabilitation program. Since you've chosen to deny your crimes and attempt to manipulate me instead, this inheritance is now null and void." I walked to the fireplace and dropped the documents into the flames, watching Preston's face as his financial future turned to ash. "This is insane," he shouted, jumping up from his chair. "You can't just burn money because you're angry about misunderstandings." "Actually," Jonathan interjected, "she can do exactly that. It's her money to dispose of as she sees fit. And your criminal behavior has forfeited any legal claim you might have had to inherit it." I moved to Margot's envelope, opening it to reveal similar documents outlining her potential inheritance. $2.1 million, Margon, because you chose to treat your crimes as misunderstandings and your victim as someone who could be manipulated into silence. Her legal documents joined Preston's in the fire as she watched in stunned silence, apparently still unable to believe that her attempt at negotiation had failed so completely. Finally, I opened Tobias's envelope, showing him the photographs and property deeds that represented his share of what had been our family wealth. $1.8 million to buy. Also gone because you thought love and family relationships meant you could escape consequences for planning your mother's death. His inheritance burned alongside his siblings as the 3 of them sat in shocked silence, finally understanding that their attempt to avoid accountability had cost them everything they had schemed to steal. "But here's what happens next," I said, returning to my seat at the table. "Since you chose to deny your crimes instead of accepting responsibility, I will now be filing criminal charges against all 3 of you for elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and planning my murder. You will face the full legal consequences of your actions, and you will do so without any financial resources from my estate to fund your defense." Jonathan removed the criminal complaints from his briefcase, placing them on the table where my children could see their names listed as defendants in multiple felony charges. "These will be filed with law enforcement this afternoon," he said. "You should probably contact attorneys immediately. though I should warn you that the evidence against you is overwhelming and most competent lawyers will advise you to consider plea bargaining rather than fighting charges you can't win. The transformation in my children's faces as they realized the full magnitude of their situation was both satisfying and heartbreaking. They had entered this confrontation believing they could manipulate their way out of consequences, and they were leaving as criminals facing prison time with no money to defend themselves. But as they gathered their things and prepared to leave my house for what I knew would be the last time, I felt no triumph or satisfaction. I felt only the profound sadness of a mother who had been forced to destroy her own children to protect herself from their cruelty. They had chosen their fate through their own actions, and now they would face the consequences of believing that love meant never having to earn anything and family meant never being held accountable for betrayal. The education was complete, and the grades they had earned would follow them for the rest of their lives. The weeks following the confrontation passed in a strange mixture of liberation and loneliness that I hadn't anticipated. The house felt different without the constant tension of maintaining my performance as a declining elderly woman, but it also felt emptier than it had even in the immediate aftermath of Richard's death. At least then, I had still believed I had children who loved me. Now I knew the truth about what they had become. Jonathan filed the criminal complaints that afternoon as promised, and by evening the local news had picked up the story of 3 adult children charged with conspiracy to exploit their elderly mother. The coverage was sensational but accurate, focusing on the sophisticated nature of their planning and the extensive evidence that had been gathered against them. Within days, the story had been picked up by regional and then national media, turning my family's dysfunction into a cautionary tale about greed and elder abuse. Preston was the first to be arrested, taken into custody at his Chicago office in front of his colleagues and clients. The humiliation was immediate and devastating, costing him not just his freedom but his professional reputation and likely his marriage. Carmen filed for divorce within a week of his arrest, taking their children and moving in with her parents while publicly distancing herself from any knowledge of his plans regarding my money. Margot's arrest came at her law firm during a partners' meeting, creating maximum professional embarrassment and immediate suspension from practice pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. The State Bar Association opened its own investigation into her conduct, and several of her clients requested new representation when news of her charges became public. Tobias tried to flee when he learned warrants had been issued, driving his truck toward the Canadian border before being stopped at a routine traffic checkpoint. His attempt to run only added additional charges to his case and eliminated any possibility of being released on bail. As I watched my children's lives unravel in the media coverage and court proceedings, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sorrow that surprised me with its intensity. They were getting exactly what they deserved for their systematic betrayal and exploitation, but seeing them destroyed so completely reminded me of the babies I had nursed and the young adults I had launched into the world with such hope and pride. The legal proceedings moved forward with the efficiency that Jonathan had predicted, driven by the overwhelming evidence and the public attention the case had attracted. All 3 of my children retained separate attorneys who immediately began exploring plea bargain options rather than attempting to fight charges they clearly couldn't win. Preston's lawyer reached out first, proposing a guilty plea in exchange for reduced charges and a recommendation for minimum sentencing. Margot's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea that would allow her to maintain her law license and avoid prison time. Tobias's lawyer made the most honest assessment, acknowledging that the evidence was overwhelming and that his best option was to accept responsibility and hope for leniency. We rejected all plea bargain attempts. These crimes had been too sophisticated and systematic to be resolved through negotiated settlements that might minimize their seriousness. I began receiving letters from my children that ranged from desperate pleas for forgiveness to angry accusations that I had entrapped them and destroyed their lives unfairly. The emotional manipulation in their communications was remarkable, showing that even facing criminal prosecution, they continued to view themselves as victims rather than accepting responsibility for their choices. Preston wrote about his financial desperation and the pressures he had been under to provide for his family's expensive lifestyle. He claimed his actions had been motivated by fear rather than greed, begging me to consider the impact his imprisonment would have on his innocent family member. Margot's correspondence was more legalistic, challenging the interpretation of evidence and arguing that her actions had been appropriate legal advice for an elderly client with cognitive concerns. She accused me of manufacturing evidence and manipulating legal proceedings for vindictive purposes. Tobias wrote emotional letters about his love for me and his regret about any pain his actions had caused, but he consistently avoided taking responsibility for the specific crimes he had committed. He framed his behavior as misguided concern rather than criminal plan. None of their letters acknowledged the fundamental violation of trust and dignity that their actions represented. They continued to minimize their behavior and attempt to manipulate me, even from jail, demonstrating that they had learned nothing from their situation. The most difficult part of this period was dealing with my own complex emotions about what I had accomplished and what it had cost. I felt vindicated by the success of my plan and satisfied that justice was being served, but I also felt profound grief for the loss of relationships I had treasured even after discovering their fraudulent nature. But gradually I began to rebuild my life around relationships and activities that brought genuine satisfaction rather than obligation or expectation. I resumed painting with an energy and creativity that surprised me, creating works that reflected both my pain and my newfound freedom from manipulation and false expectations. Most importantly, I began using my wealth and freedom to support causes and organizations that reflected my values. I established a foundation focused on elder abuse prevention and education, using my experience and resources to help other elderly people recognize and protect themselves from exploitation by family members and caregivers. The foundation work was particularly fulfilling because it transformed my personal trauma into a resource for preventing similar crimes against other vulnerable people. I hired staff with expertise in legal advocacy, social services, and criminal justice to develop comprehensive programs for education, prevention, and victim support. Jonathan helped me structure the foundation to ensure it would continue operating effectively long after my death, creating an institutional legacy that would outlast any family inheritance and provide ongoing benefits to people who needed protection and support. As winter turned to spring and the legal proceedings against my children moved toward resolution, I found myself feeling more peaceful and purposeful than I had in years. The elaborate deception and careful planning had been exhausting, but they had accomplished exactly what I had intended, protecting me from exploitation while ensuring that my children faced appropriate consequences for their criminal behavior. The trials concluded in early summer with guilty verdicts on all counts. Preston received 8 years in federal prison. Margot was sentenced to 6 years and permanently disbarred from practicing law. Tobias received 5 years and was required to pay restitution for his attempted flight. During the sentencing hearing, each of my children was given the opportunity to address the court. Preston apologized for his actions but continued to emphasize his financial pressures rather than accepting full responsibility. Margot maintained her innocence and claimed she had been providing legitimate legal advice. Tobias offered what seemed like genuine remorse, acknowledging that he had lost sight of what truly mattered in his pursuit of easy money. The judge's comments during sentencing were particularly satisfying. She noted the sophisticated nature of their conspiracy, the vulnerability of their intended victim, and the calculated cruelty of planning to exploit someone they claimed to love. She emphasized that elder abuse by family members represented a particularly heinous violation of trust that warranted significant punishment. In the months that followed, I received updates about my children's experiences in prison. Preston struggled with the harsh realities of incarceration and the loss of his comfortable lifestyle. Margot used her legal knowledge to help other inmates with their cases, perhaps finding some redemption in using her skills to help people rather than exploit them. Tobias apparently threw himself into prison art programs, creating works that reflected his genuine remorse and desire for rehabilitation. I felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but I felt peace in knowing that justice had been served and that they were finally facing real consequences for their actions. Prison would give them time to reflect on their choices and hopefully develop the character and work ethic they had never been required to cultivate. On quiet evenings when I sat in Richard's chair and reflected on everything that had transpired, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond revenge or vindication. I had protected not just my money and property but my dignity and autonomy. I had ensured that their crimes would not go unpunished and that other potential victims would be warned about the signs of family exploitation. But perhaps most importantly, I had proven that love without respect was worthless, that family relationships based on financial expectation were fraudulent, and that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is teach their children that actions have consequences, even when those consequences are devastating. The foundation I established grew rapidly, helping hundreds of elderly people recognize and protect themselves from exploitation. We developed educational programs, legal advocacy services, and support networks that made real differences in people's lives. The work gave my life new purpose and meaning that was independent of family relationships and entirely under my own control. I was 74 years old, wealthy beyond most people's dreams, and completely free to live my remaining years according to my own values and choices. My children had tried to steal that freedom, but they had instead given me something more valuable: the knowledge that I was strong enough to protect myself and principled enough to demand justice, regardless of the personal cost. The woman they had tried to destroy was not only alive but thriving, and she intended to make the most of every day she had left on this earth. The funeral they had planned would have to wait for someone else, because Loretta Hughes was far from finished with living. My children had spent months planning my funeral while I was planning their financial funeral. In the end, the only thing that died was their sense of entitlement and their access to wealth they had never earned. They learned that respect cannot be inherited, that love cannot be faked forever, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon an elderly person possesses is the wisdom to recognize when they're being betrayed by the people they trust most. The house that had once echoed with their calculated conversations about my death, now filled with the voices of foundation staff, volunteers, and grateful families who had been helped by our program. Instead of planning my demise, I was celebrating life and using my resources to protect others from the kind of exploitation I had endured. That was my true inheritance to leave behind, not money that could be stolen or wasted, but a legacy of protection, education, and justice that would continue long after I was gone. My children had taught me that blood relationships mean nothing without character, but they had also shown me that real family can be created through shared values and mutual respect. The funeral they had planned never happened, but the financial funeral I arranged for their greed was complete and permanent. Justice had been served, lessons had been learned, and life was ready to begin again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.